Hello, hello. This is Marlon Weems, the journeyman, and I am here with my good friend Arturo Dominguez. And for those of you who do not know, and the reason that I wanted to talk to him this afternoon is that Mr. Dominguez, in my opinion, is one of the most knowledgeable independent voices out there as it relates to um, immigration, Cuba, just the perspective of Latinos, and especially in Texas, which is where he's located. But just being able to give, uh, I think, an unvarnished and non-corporate view on just what's going on in the U.S. and in this case, and the reason I really wanted to speak with him was related to a recent piece that he did on what's happening in Cuba as it relates to some of the United States machinations and fooling with with that country's government. Before I get too far, I wanted to, I guess I should do a little bit of housekeeping and encourage everyone who isn't already a subscriber to please consider not only subscribing, but becoming a paid supporter, because that is what allows folks like Arturo and myself to continue this work. And if things were in a better shape, we'd probably both, be enjoying our summer right now. But that is unfortunately not not where we are. So with
Right.
that, again, we appreciate all those who are able to support us in turn. Either way, both as a subscriber, obviously you can share the work with other people, and certainly if you can provide some additional support, that goes a long way as well. So, with that said, Arturo, welcome, and I am just going to turn it over to you. I think maybe if you could just sort of expand or explain your recent piece on Cuba and just what's going on and why we should care.
Well, with regards to Cuba, everybody pretty much knows about, over 6 decades of, unilateral, basically blockade of Cuba, right? With it under Obama, he normalized a lot of relationships, um, back and forth between Cuba and the US. And that helped Cuba's private sector quite a bit because Cuba, a lot of people don't know this, but Cuba does have a lot of private business. Um, and under Obama, it did just wonders for the economy there. Even though he wasn't able to, remove a lot of the sanctions and stuff because of the Helms-Burton Act, that's all legislation that takes an act of Congress to change. But he did do a lot, and it improved the situation a lot. But then Trump comes in, and he brings a bunch of hardliner Cuban Americans and a lot of white people and they started on a campaign of what he called maximum pressure, and they basically rolled back everything Obama did, and then started bringing back sanctions and different policies that hadn't been around since like the 80s. So they were really trying to cripple Cuba as much as possible. And the way the U.S. gets away with this, as far as like any human rights concerns, is the United States sends food right to Cuba to try to say, look, we're not starving the people, right? But what they send, a lot of people like to bring up how much chicken, for example, the US sends per year to Cuba. But when you do the math for 11 million people, including the children and everything, it works out to about 5 pounds of chicken a month, you know, per person, if
Okay.
that. And it's not really a lot. So it's almost identical to what Israel does with Palestine, where they send in just enough food to keep people alive, right? So they can skirt saying, look, you're using starvation as a weapon. And essentially that's what the US is doing, right? They block everything else and then they say, we're only going to allow this much food in to keep this many people alive. And it's like a colonialist type of imperialist strategy. Cuba for the United States is strategically is key because with Cuba, essentially, the United States could lock down the Gulf of Mexico if it was in the US's hands. But it isn't. And because of that, like Venezuela can ship stuff in and out of the Gulf. They ship stuff to Cuba, they ship oil to Cuba. And the way a lot of countries skirt being sanctioned is they donate or they trade. So, a couple of years ago, Mexico was sending tons of oil to Cuba to keep the power grid going. And Cuba was returning the favor by providing them aggregate material for their train, that the Maya train that went from northern Mexico to southern Mexico. And that trade skirted Mexico being sanctioned for providing oil to Cuba. So there's a lot of people will say, well, Cuba can trade with all these countries. That's how they do it because Cuba's cash poor. They don't have any access to money markets. They don't have any access to banking. They can't borrow
And that's
money.
that's because of us, is it not?
Right. Right. Any country that deals with Cuba is subject to sanctions by the
Okay.
US.
So what does
So,
Cuba have in the way of natural resources?
well,
I mean, it's
there's
just a
quite a
small
bit.
island, really. So
Right. It's mostly agricultural. But there's gold and stuff. And they don't allow drilling off their coast. So there's some oil fields around the area, but I don't think they're that expansive. In terms of what Cuba has, it's a strategic location. And one of the reasons why we have a base at Guantanamo is because of that strategic position. Because at that western tip, it provides the US Navy quite a bit of power for monitoring the Gulf of Mexico. So
right.
when, for example,
So
when immigrant
explain to me. I have never understood, and I'm not. I like history, but I wouldn't say I'm a student of history like some people. Um, of course, I know about the Bay of Pigs a bit. How is it that we have Guantanamo? I mean, you may, if you know, I mean, not putting you on the spot, but I've never understood with our relationship with Cuba, how do we have that base there?
well, we have the base. It originally started when the Cubans were rising up against the Spaniards to
Okay.
expel the Spaniards out of Cuba, and the U.S. provided support for that. But part
Okay.
of getting the Spaniards out of Cuba was to keep the United States out of Cuba too. The
Right.
problem with it is at that point they were, from the time that the Cubans expelled the Spaniards, every president in Cuba had been installed by the U.S. Right, so
Right.
it was easy for them to get a 99-year lease for Guantanamo, build a base there, and pay hardly anything for it. Um, and that was one of the things that led to the revolution, Castro's revolution. It's just
Okay.
every president was like a dictator, oppressed the non-white populations, the Chinese, the Afro-Cubans, even like my family originally, we came to Cuba in the late 1800s from Portugal, right? And even those people who were working the fields alongside enslaved people were being treated the same. Sorry, they were being treated the same, and they were getting paid very minimal, for migrant workers. The Spaniards were bringing in Chinese, they were bringing in people from everywhere, Italians. Like if you really look deep into Cuban culture, it is super diverse because of that. Um, so part of when Castro led the revolution, his whole thing was desegregate the island. Right, it was all civil rights. It was all everybody equal. You
Hmm.
know, and the reason here's when you look at the mass migration out of Cuba right after Castro took over, it's all the white Cubans, all the Cubans that had power over Afro Cubans and the minority groups. These were all the same people who didn't allow black Cubans to go to the swimming pools or certain parks, and they were only allowed to live like in rural areas in the mountains. Like if you look at old video clips of Havana back in the 50s, it's all white people.
Oh yeah.
There's hardly a black person to be found because they were all shoved out
I've
in the
seen The
field.
Godfather Part Two. I
Right,
mean,
right.
they
And that was
basically, fictionalize it, but yeah.
right. Believe it or not, that was truly one of the things was that a lot of the people that owned all the land were selling Cuba off like it was Vegas, and mobsters were moving in like it was Vegas, and that was the mobster thing was the last straw for a lot of Cubans. For a bunch of other Cubans, like Castro and his revolution, it was before that. It was Batista. He was the last dictator before Castro, super oppressive. The U.S. was rigging elections for him to win because he was providing access to all their resources. They had, Texaco had refineries in Cuba, and all the sugar plantations and all that stuff were owned by U.S. corporations. And essentially, the revolution was they were tired of other people extracting their wealth and them getting nothing. Same thing that's going on in Africa, right?
Right.
So, and a lot of people don't understand that. So when you see the Cuban lobby here in the U.S., the only people that ever get any voice are white Cubans, right? Um, and a lot of these white Cubans are opposed to Cubans coming to the U.S. now because the majority, it's 62% black in Cuba now. And white Cubans are a huge minority. In fact, if you go, when they do the census, or if you go anywhere and they ask you like your race for paperwork or whatever, if you say you're white, this is a common thing in Cuba. They will laugh in your face and they'll ask you to show me a picture of your grandma because I bet you're not white. You know what I mean? And that's
Right.
because of that real deep connection to our African culture. And in the US, all the Cubans here, they kind of shun the African culture. A lot of them will say, "Oh, we're from Spain," and try to distance themselves from Cuba. And when you start really digging into why they're pressing so hard to try to overthrow the government in Cuba, it's not communism because Cuba has been like a socialist slash capitalist state for a little while now, right? They're moving like what Vietnam's doing, what China's doing. They're getting advice from economists in China and Vietnam on how to change things. And that's what Cubans want, right? They're not trying to go to war with each other. They don't want a civil war. They're not interested in overthrowing governments. They just want their life to be made easier. And, if the US were to lift the sanctions, that would happen overnight. I think the biggest issue for the United States on the government scale is when you're talking Joint Chiefs and stuff. If you have a socialist country 90 miles off your coast that is hugely successful, it's going to be a problem for the United States. And I think
Mm.
politically, that's the issue, right? Because as poor as Cuba is, there are no homeless people. Nobody's starving like they say they are. There are food shortages, but people get food, and they have healthcare and free education, all the way to PhD, and it's one of the smartest countries in the world. And you wouldn't know that based on what you hear here in the United States, right? Their literacy rate is like 99%. It's crazy, right? And they protect the few indigenous Tainos that are left on the island that still live in the mountains, everything. The thing that when it comes to terms of race, where Castro failed was you hear a lot of these communists, right? We don't need to discuss race. We need class consciousness. That was Castro's mistake, right? He thought once he liberated everybody, civil rights for everybody, and all this, that eventually racism would just die down. And it didn't. Because even as the country did better, say an Afro-Cuban wanted to get a job at a hotel, if they did hire them, they'd be in the back somewhere because they had the perception that guests wanted to see white people. They wanted to see white Cubans. So there was this huge racist thing. And now there's policies and discrimination is like severely, illegal. And none of that is acceptable. And it was late 80s when Castro admitted that that was his mistake, not tackling racism head on really hurt the country more than had he, because he was afraid that it would disrupt the class consciousness on the island by bringing up race issues. He felt like it would be divisive. And since then, since the mid to late 90s, there's been a lot of policies put in place. And like you see more Afro Cubans than ever in the big cities in Havana. And there's a lot of middle class Cubans, Afro Cubans that you never saw before. Home ownership exists in Cuba, and there are, a lot of black homeowners now. And it was not that way before. Even under Castro, it was tough for Afro Cubans. But now it's a
Mm.
lot. It's improving, but again, you have this maximum pressure campaign, and my recent article, I talk about how Trump and Rubio and a bunch of other hardliners are starting to push these policies again from the 80s and even going back to like the 60s and 70s, where the idea was to starve the people into an uprising. And that's essentially what the strategy is becoming now. They're denying people visas. For example, part of the story was, and I'm not sure how many people know about the diversity visa lottery. But there's a lottery, right, for diversity visas, and the U.S. gives out about 55,000 a year.
Now,
To very
diversity based on what does that mean?
diversity is like a diversity of countries.
Okay,
They call it a diversity visa, but it's like a
so it's
diversity of
it's
countries.
not a DEI visa.
No, it's not. It's not. But recently, a Brit was filed a case because they denied him. He wanted a diversity visa, and they denied it at the end of the day. And a lot of people were like, "This is a white dude. That's a diversity visa." And I'm like, "That's not what that means. It's a diversity of countries." So there was I don't remember exactly how many, but quite a few, several dozen Cubans that won the lottery visa, and because of Trump's travel ban and Rubio's visa restriction policies that he put these visa restrictions on the president of Cuba and the vice president and their families, right? But the way it's worded is that if you've essentially worked for the government for more than 5 years, you can't get this visa because you're a national security threat because you might be communist. And
And wait a minute, and Rubio is Cuban, right? Or well,
yeah, well,
that's
according to
his parents were.
right, according to Cubans on the island, and I have never seen them say this, but he's no longer Cuban. They're like, he's just a
He's
gringo,
lost
man.
his card.
Right? I've never, Cubans tend to accept even the worst of us. Like, unfortunately, some of us are like that. But with Rubio, I've been seeing it on social media. They're like, this guy's not Cuban anymore. He's just a white boy now. Yeah, he's never really been to Cuba. So a lot of people in Cuba were bragging for that, for having such harsh policies and never having been there. Um, so yeah, with these things like Cuba is the Cuban government is the largest employer on the island, right? Because it owns all the infrastructure and all that stuff, so it has to employ people to take care of those things. And to say that somebody who worked for the Cuban government can't come to the U.S. just because they worked for the government is
Well, I
kind of
mean,
shady.
I would imagine the United States, our government
Right,
is the largest.
right.
Well, it was before Trump came in. Who knows now the way they're laying off? But
Yeah,
so, could you talk a little bit in your article? What jumped out at me was really, I guess, at the beginning where you were describing how um, someone had just recently been appointed to the Organization of American States, or the
right.
OAS, and there are all these various interest groups that are getting funding from the Heritage Foundation. So which all that traces back to Project 2025, and so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so there's this lady, Rosa Maria Paya, right? She is the founder of uh, Cuba Decide, which is Cuba Decide. And it's a bilingual, English and Spanish media outlet. And they often brag about how they're not government funded, right? They're not part of Radio Marti or any of that stuff. But they get their money from organizations that are funded by the government, by the US government. And one of the more problematic ones regarding funding, and I'll get to OAS in a second, but it comes from the NED, and the National Endowment for Democracy.
Okay,
And though they are technically a private institution, right? But their funding is like 90 something percent comes from the or from the US government. And um, Congress approves their budget, how much money they get, so it's congressional funding that the NED gets. They fund Cuba Decide. And then the other one is the Memorial for the Victims of Communism. It's like a
okay,
museum in Miami. They also fund her group, and that museum gets their money from the Heritage Foundation. Very far right, you know, all that stuff. So Maria Paya, um, she's a Cuban hardliner. Like if there's a policy that's choking people, she wants you to choke them more. Um, and again, it's not about communism and or any of that. It's about strategic position, about making that a colony like Puerto Rico, and it's about extracting resources and all that stuff. And for her, there was an independent panel. She was recently appointed to the Organization of the American States, right? The Human Rights, the Inter American Commission of Human Rights, and as she was appointed as the head of that. And there was a lot of protest from all the countries because the Organization of American States includes Canada, U.S., and everything in Latin America, the Caribbean, and all that. So every country has representation there, and the majority of the countries represented there had raised alarms about Paya being appointed to the Human Rights Council of the OAS because nothing that she stands for represents human rights in any way.
Okay.
And they talked about how she had a lack of understanding of the law, of international law, of human rights, and all this stuff. Well, according to the Cuban government, and you can take this however you want, they allege that the U.S. put pressure on other countries to vote her in by threatening to take resources, grant programs, contracts, aid funding, and stuff like that. Essentially, play ball, or we're going to take our money.
Now,
And
is this someone that was appointed under Trump? Is it that
right,
recent?
she was picked. She was picked by Marco. She was picked by Marco Rubio. That's who picked who sits on the OAS.
Okay.
So so yeah, there were a lot of other people that were qualified, but they weren't hardliners. So Rubio went with the hardliner. And so there's major issues with that because historically, both the NED and OAS have been linked to the violent overthrow of governments. In 2014, the National Endowment for Democracy was linked to the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, which is a point of contention with Russia and the situation that we're in now.
Hmm.
So it's about when you look at a lot of U.S. policy, right? The policy is about disruption. They want to keep a country in shambles because the more that it's in chaos is going on, we can intertwine our fingers into their resources, into their economies, into all that stuff. You know, with Mexico did a great job of taking those fingers out of their economy with the election of AMLO because before then you had a bunch of U.S. approved presidents
Hmm.
and Mexicans are sick of that. So you get AMLO gets huge election number. You get Claudia Sheinbaum who won with like 80% of the vote. That same mentality, you see that in Cuba, you see that in Venezuela, you see that in a lot of countries that we claim are dictatorships. But when you look at what we do and what they do and compare, that's not a dictatorship. This is a dictatorship by committee. That's essentially when it comes to foreign policy, we're a dictatorship by committee. If you're willing to starve 11 million people on an island for, the benefit of U.S. corporate interests and not really much else, you know, who's the dictator here?
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's a strange situation, because I know people will look at how long Castro was in power and he was a dictator, but he was a widely supported, they called it a dictatorship of the proletariat. The people supported him. He stayed in office because they let him, and if Cubans really, really wanted to overthrow their government, I'm pretty sure 11 million people could pull that off on an island, you know? And they don't because a lot of Cubans are, they like the freedoms they have because Cuba's not this oppressive society where cops are just beating you on the head for no reason all the time, even though that's what they make it seem like. They're, it's, I call it a democracy because it kind of is. I've tried to compare their election system to our election system. And when you look at, for example, if you wanted to run for a local committee that represents your neighborhood, you're not allowed to run ads. You post your resume on shop windows and businesses and
Mm.
people read it. And, then you have little meetings in the community and people vote for you and stuff. And it's that way all the way up to the Cuba's legislature, which has like 460 seats. When when they passed the new family bill in Cuba, I say new, this was a few years ago. They wanted to, they asked the question, about trans rights, about gay marriage. Should gay couples be able to adopt? Um, and the family code. And like they listened to the people agreed on certain things. And then they put it to a vote. They let the people vote, not the legislature, not anybody else. And 80% of the people gave trans people trans rights. They gave gay rights to, gay marriage rights. They allowed gay people to adopt. It was pretty cool to see that that's how they decided,
Hmm.
you know, how things should be, and to see that, something like 6, 7 million people were allowed to vote, and 90% of them voted. In that family code, there was also restrictions because there's a lot of rich white guys that'll go down there to Cuba, try to find them a teenage or very young prostitute
Hmm.
and convince them they can give them this life in the US and, marry them there. And then once they're married, they can try to bring them here. Cuba put a stop to that. You you can't, anybody under the 18 is not allowed to marry a foreigner like that, leave the country like that, because they put serious restrictions on it because it was a huge problem.
Hmm.
Um, and parents can't just say, "Yeah, I'm going to send my kid with this white man to the U.S." They have to. If a parent thinks they want to do that, they have to take it to a court. And like in Texas, if somebody under 17 wants to get married, they have to go, and parents have to show up in court, say, "Yeah, I'm only going to allow this." And that's the same thing here, right? Um, with Cuba. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that what Trump is doing right now really doesn't make sense. The visa restrictions are like, for example, just last week, a softball team of like 8 and 9-year-old little girls, right? They doing their softball thing. They're moving up in the ranks in the international scene. They were going to go play at a semifinal in Puerto Rico. The U.S. denied their visas to go play in a semifinal for softball, and they denied their visas because of these visa restrictions that Rubio has put in place, and
Unbelievable.
the travel ban too from Trump. So I'm not so sure what threat 8 and 9-year-olds pose to Puerto Rico or the United States, but some things are just ridiculous, and it just doesn't make any sense. And it's just like they want to be assholes to be assholes. You know what I mean? Like they enjoy it. I don't get it. I don't
Yeah,
get it.
we talk about that all the time. I'm curious now, you also have a another journalist that you're working with in Cuba. So what's the
Yeah.
story there?
So Francisco Lozano is a guy I've worked with before. He's a great photojournalist. An article I recently did on the LA protests. He provided me some video and images for that story, and gave me a quote too because ICE was in his neighborhood. So like I wanted to know from a human perspective, how does this shit make you feel? And he was pretty angry about it. Francisco, uh, unfortunately, his wife passed away a few months ago from cancer. She battled that for like a year and a half. So the trip to Cuba for Francisco is twofold. He tends to go every couple of years, and him and I have worked together each time he's ever went. One time he went, he met my family. I thought that was really cool. This time it's for the same type of stuff. We want to try to tell the stories of the Cuban people. But he's also hoping to find some healing while he's there. Because he's always been embraced. He's a Mexican guy, from LA, and he's always been embraced by the Cuban people. Everybody's always treated him well. They invite him over for dinner, that kind of stuff. So he gets along really well down there. And he's going to be there for 2 weeks. So I spent most of the last few days, especially last night, because he left early. He left this morning, and he should be there now. But I spent the last few days trying to work out some logistics for him, lay out some contacts for him with a lot of other independent journalists I know there.
Hmm.
and I've worked with them before on like stories of an independent journalist that was jailed for nothing more than filming a bunch of activists spreading flyers, throwing flyers off a building, and he's been in jail for the last 4 years for that. So I'm not I'm not sitting here saying everything's great in Cuba because it isn't. It isn't. Um, Anything that's seen as a threat to the state or like you're trying to provoke some kind of uprising
Hmm.
is a crime. Is a crime. So yeah, he's been in there. His health isn't great. I still talk to his wife. I interviewed her for a story for Latino Rebels, and you see that kind of stuff. So I hooked up Francisco with the crew of it's called Belly of the Beast, and it's an independent
Right.
media outlet, right? And they call themselves that because Cuba, the U.S. treats Cuba like the beast, and they come to the U.S. occasionally. Liz is their front person journalist who does all their video content. She's questioned the State Department, face to face. She's been in Congress questioning people. She, follows a lot of these hardliners and reports a lot on what they're trying to do to Cuba. At the same time, she goes through the island and she talks to Cubans, and Cubans will tell you all kinds of stuff are wrong. There's food shortages, there's fuel shortages, there's all these things. And they do blame their government for a lot of things. The government's not perfect, right? They blunder economic issues constantly in Cuba. But the story of them not being interested in going to war with each other still holds. They have faith that their government will do the right things. They have faith that these new economic reforms that started several years ago are going to start taking shape. You know, Cuba joining BRICS helps a lot because dealing not having to deal with U.S. currency allows them to get stuff from, like, for example, like Japan has donated tons of metro buses. So like if you see Cuba now, you see these modern looking buses, that's where they came from. Japan will send ship containers full of buses and parts and stuff like that. Um, so now with BRICS, it opens some doors with Cuba because they can deal with China in whatever currency. They can deal with Russia. They can deal with India. They can deal with Brazil outside of these U.S. sanctions. And last year, maybe a year before Marco Rubio was in the State Department, he was on Fox News in this all-out panic about BRICS because all these countries using their own currency means they're not using U.S. currency, and it hurts the U.S.'s ability to sanction. And those were his words. It
And
hurts our
tell you
ability.
what else with the tariffs and everything that Trump is doing that's weakening the dollar.
Yeah,
It's really, I'm not saying it will happen, but it's probably given the BRICS an excellent opportunity to make the argument that the dollar should not be the reserve currency. Now,
right,
I happen to think if that were to change, it would probably be the yuan, China's currency that's in the best position, but still, which don't get me started on Trump and economic policy.
right.
You know what? I want to change because I'm just looking at the time and every time we talk, the hour goes real quick.
It does. It
I
does.
want to talk about Texas because I know you're in Texas.
Hmm.
And I'm just yesterday I heard Trump basically they're talking about having a special election so that they can just create some more or basically gerrymander even more than they are already, which at least let Trump tell it. They think that'll create 5 more seats because
Hmm.
they're so worried. They can see that the midterms are coming up and his approval ratings are falling through the floor. And so I just to the extent that you're hearing anything about that, that would be interesting to
Yeah.
talk about.
So Greg Abbott called for a special session because for other reasons other than the gerrymandering, but he called a special session mainly because the ban on weed here in Texas, he didn't sign it into law. and he wants to renegotiate that. But
So
then
what is
once
he gonna do it or what?
well, Dan Patrick led this campaign to ban weed because they passed the law a few years ago, and the way they worded the law, they didn't realize that they actually legalized it
Dude, they did the
under
same thing in North Carolina. You
right
get these,
under
but
certain
that's what happens when you don't have experts.
right,
These
right, right,
these
like
guys think
potheads.
they can do everything without knowing anything.
Yeah, so before you knew it, right after that law passed, the dispensary opened up right around the corner from my house. I'm like, this can't be like legit, right? I go in there and sure as hell, it is. I'm like, let me buy some just to see, you know. Sure enough, no problem. Check my ID, you know, you had to pay cash for it, you know, no credit
Right? Because
card,
they
but
can't use
still
banks.
right. So then Dan Patrick led this campaign to ban weed, all of it, everything, even the Delta 9s and
How
the
much money is
different
that costing?
that's the problem. They accidentally created a $1 billion industry in this state. So when it came time to get rid of it, there was a lot of lobbying against it.
Mm,
But Republicans and Dan Patrick pushed it through, pushed it through, pushed it through. Then it gets to Greg Abbott's desk, and he only has so much time to sign it or veto it, or it
okay.
gets tossed out. And man, it sat on his desk for weeks. And during that time, man, he was getting hammered, hammered. And right an hour before the deadline, he vetoed it and said, "We're going to call a special session. We're going to redo this because there, you know, a lot of big industry was about to be hurt. The dispensary here close to my house closed just because the bill passed. They didn't
Mm-hmm.
before Greg Abbott even signed it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so now they're going to do that, but in the midst of that, they're going to try to allocate funding for sirens for the flooding. And they recently decided they're going to redistrict the state again.
Okay.
And this will be like the third time in a decade. And so I used to be in Dan Patrick's district that was shaped like a C
Yeah.
that encompassed Latino and Black communities, but also went way north outside of the city and, you know, encompassed a lot of white suburbia and rural white
Mm-hmm.
northeast Texas. So it whitewashed our boat, you know. We were at the mercy of Kingwood and things like that. They redistricted his, and he's no longer our representative. Mine is Wesley Hunt now, not any better. And so, for example, Dan Crenshaw's new district goes all the way down into the fifth ward, goes through like the third ward. These are predominantly Black and Latino
Right.
communities, and then goes all the way to rich white suburbia. So now he only campaigns in rich white suburbia,
Sure.
doesn't even bother down here because 59% of the vote is up there, 41% down here. See what I mean? So like
Oh yeah.
now,
I mean,
now that vote
I live in the South too, so
right. So, and people don't understand that. Like when they started bashing Texans after the flood, you get what you voted for. It's like, dude, we're one of the most voter suppressed states in the South. Like, you're not understanding that 5 million people voted for Kamala Harris and she still lost the state. None of those people deserved anything what's happening. Hell, even Trump voters didn't deserve what happened to lose their children like that. But I get where people were coming from. That's the
mhm.
infrastructure we voted for type situation. But um, not I didn't vote for that. And you know, there's this argument about the sirens and things too. You know, we get flooding nonstop, and I didn't know any state used flash flood sirens until recently because I've never heard one or seen one. All I know is I've woken up in the house knee deep in water. No siren, no warning, no
Wow.
nothing. It's happened to me in 1994. It happened to me. So, and then we lived along the San Jacinto River for like 8 years. We never got a warning when when they open up the floodgates at the dam. The dam has a siren, but the dam is 100 miles from us. We're downstream. They're not telling people downstream it's coming. You know, they don't tell you. You just wake up and it's there. And it's always been that way in Texas. So seeing a lot of these people, like I heard stories about one of the reasons why they didn't accept that Biden money for sirens was because basically the wealthy white people along the river in central Texas didn't want those sirens because they tend to go off accidentally and it's noisy and their house is up on a hill and it's not going to flood. They're not worried about the
Mm.
siren
I
or
saw
their
a
house flood.
video. I'll try to post it, and it is it appears to be like a city council meeting where they're talking because I think Biden and I
Yeah.
haven't checked, but I suspect this is maybe related to, um, the Interest Rate Reduction Act. I
Right.
think,
I think
and
that's what.
it was
Yeah.
like 10 million, a little over $10 million that was allocated. Is it Carr County? I think
Kirk County.
KR.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hmm.
and it's like some sort of meeting, and it's just one person after another saying we don't want this money, and it's not, dude. It's like, like crazy.
Yeah.
You're making a deal with the devil, and this. It's
Socialism.
just really crazy talk,
Yeah.
and that's what's so frustrating is that we've got a whole subset of people now that are in a whole different conspiracy driven reality that's just
Yeah. I mean,
got us
remember,
where we are now.
right? This is the state that bought into the whole Jade Helm nonsense under Obama. Even the
Oh yeah,
governor,
yes,
even the
I
governor sent the
remember.
National Guard to follow the military around because they thought Obama was going to invade Texas to take our guns. Are
I
you
remember
kidding
that.
me?
And these
I
guys,
this
look, these guys push these conspiracy theories and they know that it's not true. They know.
right.
I mean, look at what Trump's doing now with Epstein, not to get too far afield, but he's now saying that this is Obama.
Yeah.
We
That it's a
listened to this
Democrat.
guy talking about Epstein for 10 years. And now
Right.
he's saying he's the victim of a conspiracy. And it's too much. I mean, one of the things that we're dealing with here, and I actually posted something about it this morning, is, again, karma. We've got, schools getting ready to open.
Right.
And
I seen the
and
poster here.
yeah, and it's like 3 million. No, I'm sorry. It's over 160 million that's just not coming. We're supposed to get
Right.
that money earlier this month. New Hanover County, which is well, it's basically Wilmington, which is 25 miles from where I am. Um, they're losing 3 million, right at 3 million. But
Wow.
who's getting hurt the most? All these
Right.
rural counties that voted for Trump.
Yep.
And they're
Their
saying
kids.
it may be if the money doesn't either get released or if they don't find another, which I don't know what it would be, but some
Yeah.
other source, what it basically forces a school district to do is go hand in hand to these different, oh, uh, um, NGOs and so forth, 501c3s, and then
Yeah.
you got to be careful who you take your money from, right?
Right.
But they're saying that if it's not dealt with, 1,000 teachers are going to lose their jobs,
Wow.
and we already don't have enough teachers.
Yeah.
Now, on a personal level, my kid's not going to public school anymore, but it's just so sad.
It is. It is. Yeah. Like a couple years ago, we had some school budget issues, and uh, Republicans blocked a school funding bill, and there were whole districts here that were losing $100 million shortfall budget shortfalls, 100 million, 140 million, $150 million budget shortfalls. And I thought, how do you compensate for that as a school district? But they cut
Oh, you know
resources.
what they
Let
did here?
let's
They literally cut like $1 million from preschool programs over in Wilmington just to try to, they're just juggling money, right?
yeah,
So yeah, it's really something. But and of course, they're looking at Democrats to fix it.
right,
You know,
right,
we
right,
we had a
right,
really interesting outcome in our election, the presidential election. Basically all of the top level positions, governor, lieutenant governor. Um, we have what's called a supervisor of education, I think, which is basically the education department. That
right,
person, and there were MAGA folks. Well, we had the guy that this black guy, Mark Robinson, that was just crazy. And so
was he the heavy guy?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I remember
He's
him.
really something else. Totally as far right as you could get, really. Saying
Right,
all kinds of crazy stuff. but Democrats won in every category except president, which,
Wow.
makes you think, but, not
Yeah.
to make accusations because it shouldn't have even been
Right.
close.
Right.
But,
Right.
here we are. So, yeah, we got a lot of work to do, man. A lot of work.
Yeah. I don't want to get into the whole rigged election thing, but
Oh, man, listen,
you know what I
it's
mean?
hard
God
not
damn
to
it.
when you see stuff you just really can't explain
Right.
because you're just like,
Right.
okay, so wait a minute. You voted for the governor, the lieutenant governor, all these other
Right.
folks, and you just didn't vote. You did the one
Right.
that you really needed to vote for, you didn't do it. So, but like I said, it shouldn't even be close, you know,
No, it shouldn't.
and a
It
whole
shouldn't.
lot of folks stayed at home and didn't vote. And that's on Democrats. But
There was a lot of independents too that were like, called us alarmists, and we're like,
oh,
"Oh, it's not. He's just gonna go after the criminals. They're not gonna
they
take
said the same
Medicaid."
thing about abortion,
Yeah.
didn't they? But,
Yep.
hopefully folks will learn. But, that's just what we have to deal with. Well, man,
Yeah.
as always, it's always great talking to
Yeah.
you.
Hell
I
yeah. It's
would just
cool.
say,
Fun.
just to close out, if you're not following my man on Substack, remedy that. And if you're not following me, shame on you.
Yeah.
And if you can support both of us and
Yeah.
let us continue because we got a lot. There's a lot going on, and we don't
Yeah.
have that much time. So you know, until next time, folks, I will see you on the other side. Arturo, take
Thanks,
care.
Marlon.
All
You
right.
too, man. Thank you.